The subcommittee will come to order pursuant to notice. The Subcommittee on Technology and Innovation meets to consider the following measure. The committee print the National Institute of Standards and Technology Authorization Act of 2010. I recognize myself for an opening statement. Welcome everyone for this morning's markup to the NIST portion of the America Competes bill. When the subcommittee went through this exercise in 2007, it was the first comprehensive authorization of NIST in 15 years. In the first version of Competes, we put NIST labs on a path to double its funding, and we replaced the 20-year-old Advanced Technology Program with the Technology Innovation Program, or TIP, to focus on small, high-tech entrepreneurial firms where technological innovation often occurs. However, the first version of Competes largely maintained the status quo. This new bill moves us forward to focus NIST on meeting the measurement needs of the private sector, supporting competitiveness and creating jobs. In the face of ever-increasing global technological and economic competition, it is our responsibility in Congress to support high-tech manufacturing in the United States. This bill authorizes robust funding for NIST to enable it to meet that goal. It maintains the commitment to double funding for the NIST labs and the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program, known as MEP, over 10 years. It also provides authorization for TIP consistent with the vision laid out in the original Competes Act, enabling it to meet its existing obligations and fund up to $40 million in new awards each year. This bill elevates the director of NIST to the level of Undersecretary for Technology and Standards in order to inject NIST expertise into the administration's discussions on innovation, standards, and support for high-tech growth. The current lab structure of 10 operating units is 20 years old and no longer reflects today's technology sectors or the inherent and increasing multidisciplinary nature of technology. This bill authorizes a lab structure of 6 operating units to promote efficiency in a cross-disciplinary culture at NIST. The bill also gives the NIST director permission to modify the NIST structure upon notification of Congress as technology advances and the needs of the private sector change. This legislation also structures the Manufacturing Extension Partnership to better address the challenges facing our small and medium-sized manufacturers and the revenue challenges facing our states. The legislation requires MEP centers to inform local and regional community colleges of the skill sets local manufacturers require in their workforce. It creates an innovative services initiative to help small manufacturing improve energy efficiency, use new technologies, and manufacture high-tech products. It allows the Secretary, as he deems appropriate, to modify current cost-share requirements as state budgets come under increasing pressure. This bill also creates a bioscience research program at NIST to develop measurement tools and support research that will open new fields in the treatment of disease through personalized medical biologics. After 1 full committee hearing and 3 subcommittee hearings, my subcommittee has a strong hearing record to support policy objectives for every element in this bill. We also circulated the bill text to the witnesses for their comments and suggestions, many of which have been incorporated. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and with that, I will turn to my colleague, Mr. Smith, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Wu, for calling today's markup of legislation to reauthorize the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which will be included in the America's Competes reauthorization. We are scheduled to mark up in the full committee next week. I believe there is consensus on the major issues addressed in this bill, but some questions remain, which I hope we can work through, if not completely at this markup, then certainly at the full committee markup. NIST is certainly an important and trusted arbiter of standards, weights, and measures. While the question of reauthorization level will be debated, there is no question reauthorization of NIST is vital to every sector of our economy. Given NIST's stature, it is appropriate we elevate the director of NIST to be an Undersecretary of Commerce. In our recent hearing, our panelists from private industry agreed on this point, provided the NIST director is not saddled with new duties and continues to concentrate his efforts on running the agency. Likewise, in listening to the Director's testimony and given the constantly changing state of technology, I understand his desire to restructure the labs. He does not need congressional authority to do as such, but I appreciate the Chairman's desire to codify reorganization. I hope that we will hold appropriate oversight hearings when the time is right to ensure this reorganization is adequately achieving NIST's mission. And I believe we share similar goals for the Manufacturing Extension Partnership and for NIST's role in bioscience research, if not agreement on the structure of both programs as outlined in the bill. With that, I look forward to a constructive markup today and working with you further to move toward full committee markup and floor consideration. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Does anyone else wish to be recognized for a statement? If not, I ask unanimous consent that the print be considered as read and open to amendment at any point, that the members proceed with amendments in the order of the roster. Without objection, so ordered. The first amendment on the roster is a manager's amendment offered by the chair. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 271, manager's amendment to committee print offered by Mr. Wu of Oregon.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment. The manager's amendment makes two changes to Section 3 of the committee print. First, it strikes the duties that were set out for the Undersecretary of Commerce. It also clarifies duties that the Undersecretary is charged with carrying out are the duties as provided under the National Institute of Standards and Technology Act or as prescribed by the Secretary of Commerce. Our intent is to make the Director of NIST an Undersecretary, but not to make the Undersecretary responsible for additional duties separate and apart from his duties as Director of NIST. We are confident that the Director of NIST has the authority to and is already carrying out many of the duties that were specified in the committee print. As a result, in order to avoid any confusion, we have decided to strike the list of duties and clarify that the statutory responsibilities of the Undersecretary are the same as the statutory responsibilities of the Director of NIST. The manager's amendment also makes changes to Section 6 of the committee print. Section 6 will now establish a 50% cost share for the MEP program for fiscal years 2011 through 2015. This change will ease the cost matching burden on MEP centers, given the current economic troubles and the pinch on state budgets. The Secretary will also prepare a report giving recommendations on how to structure the cost share mechanism moving past fiscal year 2015, guiding this committee in its next reauthorization of America Competes. I thank the minority for their good suggestions and urge adoption of the amendment. Is there any further discussion of the amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your willingness to address our concerns about assigning additional duties to the Undersecretary beyond his role as Director of NIST. I understand there may be some additional agreements reached on this section prior to the full committee markup, and certainly thank you for that as well. I do want to touch on the issue of kind of the timing of some of this, and I appreciate the discussion I had with the full committee chairman and Chairman Gordon prior to this. But I am going to withdraw a second degree amendment that I plan to offer, just so we can include this in the record. Given the timeline and so forth, and I don't want to get into all the details, but it's made it difficult to actually work within what has been previously the practice of the committee, which I have appreciated. So without going into all those details, though, I just hope that we can work through this. With regard to the provision in front of us now, I certainly recognize these are tough economic times. I'm concerned, however, if we do choose to alter the cost share in statute, we'll have a very difficult time returning to the existing cost share structure, which has worked well for over 20 years, certainly when the economy improves. My amendment would have taken into account the current economic hardships that many MEP centers are facing by allowing the Secretary to make a determination as to when it is appropriate to adjust the non-federal cost share. This would have allowed an adjustment in times of economic hardship without expecting the federal government to permanently take on a greater share of the cost. And my amendment would have asked the Secretary to review how the new procedures and criteria are working out and provide options for adjusting the cost share in the future if it is still necessary. The manager's amendment still does not address some of the concerns, and I would just ask if the manager and chair are willing to work with us on a solution that might be acceptable to both sides as we do move forward.
I thank the gentleman and I thank the minority for its cooperation, and I want to assure the gentleman that we will work further to address any and all concerns on both sides. And with that, I would like to recognize the chair of the full committee, the gentleman from Tennessee.
Just very quickly, I want to once again to apologize to Mr. Smith and his staff for an amendment coming in late. We're trying to do things the right way. I think we do 99 and a little bit percentage of that. So let me just say to our Democratic members as well as minority members, we will be going into a full markup next week. So please, please don't put us on the spot of getting something in late, because you may not get it in late because we want to take this coming period. Again, there's been no maliciousness, but when you have a big bill like this, there's consistencies, particularly when it comes out of 3 different subcommittees. That makes it more difficult. So let's all work together and try to get something that we're all going to be happy with 100% of the time this next Wednesday.
Would the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Thank you, Chairman Gordon. I just want to appreciate your handling of this matter, and I look forward to resolution. Thank you.
I thank the chairman and also want to again state that I want to thank Mr. Smith and cooperation on both sides in this. Is there any further discussion of the manager's amendment? Then I urge adoption of the amendment, and the vote now occurs on the manager's amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Second amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentlelady from Maryland. Ms. Edwards, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 270, amendment to the committee print offered by Ms. Edwards of Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentlelady from Maryland for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm a firstborn child, and so if I'm the offender, I want to make sure to apologize. I do have an amendment that adds a new section stating that the director in evaluating applications for fellowships under Section 18 and 19, the research fellowships and postdoctoral fellowships of NIST, shall give consideration to the goal of promoting participation of underrepresented minorities in research areas supported by the Institute. Just yesterday, Mr. Chairman, I was with the superintendent of one of our school systems, and the week prior, another of our superintendents, some of the largest school systems actually in the country, and they talked about the value of a relationship with our research institutions, and particularly NIST, for the continuation of leadership and study and research with NIST in particular, and how valuable that is to our educators, both our high school educators at our community college level and our university. And we've heard testimony before our full committee and our subcommittee about the importance of increasing postdoctoral participation in fellowships with our research institutions. We've also heard the sobering data about the number and the fewer number of minority students who are entering into these research fields. And so it's really important, I think, in terms of the amendment that I'm offering today, that we encourage the inclusion of underrepresented minorities in developing the next generation of science and technology experts. And this is an important amendment, I think, that will strengthen the bill. And the language of the amendment is giving priority consideration in particular to high-needs schools. We recognize that in the areas of science and technology, There are high-needs schools all across our congressional districts across the country, but prioritizing those high-needs schools that are giving special consideration to those high-needs schools is really important, so that we can make sure that educators who are trying to reach some of our most vulnerable populations and encouraging them to participate in STEM fields and to further their education is really important. And so I'd like to thank the chairman for your support, and especially thank the committee staff for your help in working on this important amendment. And I look forward to, we've already had some engagement with the minority members on some of the language of the amendment, which I really appreciate, and look forward to the full committee consideration next week. And
Would the gentlelady yield?
I will.
Just very quickly, this is an excellent amendment. It's been based on our committee record. And let me also say that you have set an exemplary mark for promptness and in all that you've done. And so, no, your amendment was in plenty of time and had plenty of time to be vetted. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I yield.
I thank the gentlelady for her explanation. Is there any further discussion of the amendment? Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe very strongly that discrimination is wrong. I have the same dream that Martin Luther King did, fellow Georgian, that quality of character, not color of skin, should be what people are accepted about and how government looks upon them. Any kind of discrimination is wrong, whether it's discrimination for or against. We have many laws that are very discriminatory, either positively or negatively. We are all supposed to be treated equal under the law. Everybody in this country, every human being is supposed to be treated equally under the law. And this amendment is counter to that basic philosophy that the American people generally hold across this country. So I cannot support this amendment because it is discriminatory. And I hope that this Congress, starting with this committee, can start doing what is right, and that's treating everybody in this country equal, no matter what the color of their skin is, no matter what their gender is, no matter where their forefathers came from. We need to have everybody have an equal opportunity, and this amendment strikes very strongly against that. And so I cannot support it, will not support it, and I encourage my fellow committee members to not support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Does anyone else wish to speak? The chairman of the full committee, Mr. Gordon.
Yeah, I don't want to dwell on this too long. Certainly, we all want to see that ultimate goal of the equity that you mentioned, Dr. Brown. But we all don't start off at the same starting block. And there's certainly, we have to recognize, I think, that for some groups, they were put in a hole in the past, and we have to try to dig out that hole. You know, and it's not just to be nice to someone. It is to help our country. We've had testimony time and time again on how it's important, if we're going to move forward, that we have to have greater skills in the STEM education area. And we've also learned over and over again that women and minorities simply, for a variety of reasons, don't have the interest, don't have the scores. And if we're going to bring our country up, the quickest and best place that we can do that is by bumping up these minorities and women. So, and then as that is done, then we'll get everybody to the starting block, and everyone will be equal, and our country will be better off. But we you know, this is something that we're not doing for a group. This is something we're doing for our country, I think. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank Ms. Edwards for her efforts on this issue. I do have a concern and the language giving actual priority to teachers in high-need schools. I'm sure every member here has such schools in their district, and I agree we should be strengthening the teaching skills of all teachers. I am concerned the amendment would preclude teachers in other schools from participating, and I obviously would like to ensure teachers from all schools remain eligible for the program. And Ms. Edwards, I believe we have an agreement to change the priority language to a special consideration. Is that accurate?
That is correct, Mr. Smith.
Okay, thank you. And I believe that we can address this in the full committee, and I look forward to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Is there any further discussion of this amendment? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The third amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Brown. Are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 263, amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment would help our committee conduct a more effective oversight over NIST and the entire COMPETES program. It simply keeps intact the first 3 years of authorized spending through fiscal year 2013, but it strikes out the 2-year funding levels for FY 2014 and FY 2015. It will reduce the authorized spending by $2.4 billion. The three-year authorization level is consistent with the original 2007 COMPETES authorization, and with that authorization, we found plenty to change. According to the CBO, the President's budget raises the deficit to $1.5 trillion in 2010. And our debt held by the public is ever growing. Additionally, this bill goes beyond the President's request. At an economic time such as now, why do we need to extend NIST authorization to 5 years? We don't. The fiscally responsible course to follow for our committee is to keep NIST at a 3-year authorization levels. It makes sense to keep the authorization at 3 years since it is codifying a new reorganization of the NIST labs, and 3 years is a more adequate and appropriate time frame to see if the reauthorization is working. At the end of 3 years or beforehand, our committee can always come back to the drawing board and assess how these agencies are living up to their commitments. I urge the committee to support this amendment, reducing the authorizations for this NIST reauthorization to 3 years so that we can have the opportunity to review NIST progress at that time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. It is my intention to oppose the amendment. Many of the programs at NIST are long-term programs, and when I have visited NIST facilities, I developed a deep appreciation for the very important research and other programs at NIST which have multi-year development timeframes. In addition to the needs of the NIST programs for a longer authorization, predictability, and stability, we also had testimony from our business community witnesses in our prior subcommittee hearings that from an outside perspective, it's highly preferable to have that predictability and a longer authorization period. Does anyone else? Ms. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the great privilege of representing the NIST facility in Maryland and have visited a couple of times. And one of the things that deeply impresses me with the professionalism at NIST is it's one of the few areas of government where the charge is to look to the future. And I think it's really difficult to do that in 2- and 3-year stretches. And I believe that the longer authorization is needed precisely because we want the agency to focus on developing its tools, techniques, science, and technology that really lasts us into the future. And I am opposed to this amendment. I think that there is nothing in our authorization that precludes this committee and this Congress for offering the kind of oversight that we need of the work that is going on under the authorization, under the long-term authorization. There's nothing in the authorization that would preclude us from making inquiry and visiting NIST to explore what they're doing for the future, and to have the ability to make any kind of changes we might need to in the interim. And so I support the ability of an agency like NIST in particular to focus its work under an authorization that it is secure in. And with that, I yield.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to speak in favor of the amendment. I think that given a prior policy and actually the need to continue to work on these issues in a very supportive manner, I think it's very reasonable and would certainly encourage the adoption of the
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'd like to ask the chairman a question, if I might, Mr. Chairman. Isn't it true that if we did a 3-year authorization, that even on these long-term projects, can't we always come back and reauthorize them even 2 years from now, or a year and a half from now, or 3 years from now without having to go to a 5-year authorization at this point?
If the gentleman would
yes,
yield.
I'd yield.
I thank the gentleman. While one can make assumptions about what would happen in the next reauthorization, I think that there is a predictability which many seek in being able to go beyond 1 year or 2 year or 3 years. And obviously, we don't want to stretch this out infinitely, but given the balance that we must strike, a 5-year reauthorization, in my view, is quite reasonable under the current circumstances. And I yield back to the gentleman.
Well, I thank the chairman for his comments. I respectfully disagree. I think 3 years is a good balance between just reauthorizing in just a very short period of time and 5-year authorization, and particularly in these hard economic times. We just simply don't have the money to continue to create more and more debt for our future generations in this country, and I think the American people are going to look at this and say, this Congress just continues to spend money as if there's no tomorrow. And I think by restricting the reauthorization to 3 years, it's a great balance, and I would encourage members to support this amendment. It's one, NIST certainly is one of the few truly constitutional functions that the federal government is engaged in doing. Most of what we do here in Washington is unconstitutional. We have no authorization under the Constitution according to the original intent to do a lot of the things that this Congress is doing. But NIST certainly is one of those that is authorized under the Constitution, and we need to have a good, strong NIST, and I'm a very strong supporter of a strong NIST. But again, I think a 3-year authorization just makes sense, and I encourage support of the amendment, and I yield back. And I thank Mr. Smith for yielding. Yield back.
Thank you. I will say, in adding that this amendment, I don't think stands in the way of being able to plan. In fact, I think it would encourage us to revisit the issues. I mean, we're lucky to get a 1-year budget around here, and I would suggest it needs to be a 2-year budget. And I mean, that's just one issue, though, where let's take advantage of opportunities to continue to address issues. And I think that's why this amendment is reasonable. And certainly I hope we can bring a resolution to this. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman, and I believe that the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Texas, wishes to...
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. I support the amendment, but I can count, and I know what's going to happen to it, and I remember what happened to it during the times that we debated it. for some time, but I thank the chairman for recognizing me. I'll yield back my time. I'm ready to vote when you are.
I thank the gentleman, and I believe that the gentlelady from Illinois wishes to be recognized on this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that this is a very important issue, and certainly NIST is very important, and we have the opportunity, I think, in this committee to really move the innovation, creativity ahead with all of the different projects. I am a little bit concerned that this maybe is a little bit too much, and what we're looking at is kind of a 10-year doubling path, and I know I've tried for years to get the Office of Science doubled in a lot of these projects, and it never worked out. But it's the way that this is to take what I think you've done is to take the FY10 as the baseline and then move it forward, which probably in comparison to a 10-year doubling period, by the time you get to within the 5 years, you've authorized $5,627,000 more than it would be if we were on a 10-year comparison. So, I think we really are up a creek as far as our spending, and maybe we should take a little bit to spread it out. I'm not for cutting at 3 years, but really to change the level a little bit and make it 10 years rather than what you appear to do in this bill. I would yield back.
I thank the gentlelady and the gentleman from New York.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just speak against the amendment. I think that reducing the efforts here that are made in the reforms to NIST are absolutely essential. The stronger testing patterns, the more data information, the commitment to an investment here in what needs to be a high priority in this country. I'll even reach to the prior amendment from the gentlelady from Maryland. We need to cultivate the science, the innovation, the technology early on. We need to measure our success. We need to commit to investments. And I think the stronger outcome is where we need to head. Innovation and industrial competitiveness just need to be the ruling dynamics of where we're investing today. And just cutting for the sake of cutting without prioritization is going to get us not where we need to arrive. So I think that as structured in this bill is the appropriateness, and we should stay with the given intent.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Yeah. When you reference cutting, could you elaborate on that?
Well, no, it's just I think that we need the testing patterns. We need to be able to review what we're doing with the programming. We need to make certain that we provide ample opportunity for everyone to utilize a program that I think really strengthens our industrial competitiveness. And I think that as it's structured is an appropriate response.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to suggest that this is not a cutting measure, and certainly it's not as antagonistic of an amendment as it's perhaps being characterized. But I think it does allow us and charge us with the necessary function of revisiting the issue, and I think maybe even contributing more support to the charge of the agency. But I yield back.
I was just referencing the cutting of the time frame. I just think that the more review we have, the better, the more opportunity to stretch our commitments here.
The gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion of this amendment? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say no. No. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
The
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Georgia.
Request a recorded vote, please, sir.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Wu.
No.
Chairman Wu votes no. Ms. Edwards. No. Ms. Edwards votes no. Mr. Lujan.
No.
Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Mitchell.
No.
Mr. Mitchell votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Garamendi. No. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon votes no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mrs. Biggert? Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Aiken? Mr. Aiken votes aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown votes aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Hall votes aye.
Does anyone else wish to be recorded? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 5 members vote aye and 7 members vote no.
The amendment is not agreed to. And the fourth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from Nebraska. Mr. Smith, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment adds a new section to...
The clerk, I'm sorry.
I have an amendment at the desk. Thank you.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 269, amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading, and without objection, so ordered. And I recognize the gentleman from Nebraska for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a fairly straightforward amendment. It clarifies a potential ambiguity in the current language regarding NIST's role in support of information security standards. The amendment simply states that the reference in Section 4 to the NIST IT Lab's development of cybersecurity standards and guidelines for U.S. industry and the public refers to voluntary standards and guidelines. There have been some suggestion that NIST's current standards and guidelines should, directly or indirectly, be mandated for the private sector. While there is broad agreement there is an appropriate role for NIST in assisting the private sector improve the security of its systems, regulating private cybersecurity practices could be counterproductive to our security goals. I fully realize this is not the Chairman's intent, and the language in the bill does not do this, but my amendment would ensure this remains clear by explicitly stating use of NIST's security standards and guidelines outside the federal government shall be voluntary. With that, I would ask my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Is there any further discussion of this amendment? If not, then the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The fifth amendment on the roster is an amendment offered by the gentleman from New Mexico. Mr. Lujan, are you ready to proceed with your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 047, amendment to the committee print offered by Mr. Lujan of Mexico.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Without objection, so ordered. I recognize the gentleman from New Mexico for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Innovation has always been a hallmark of American success, and the United States has the best research facilities and educational institutions in the world. And we continue to be a leader in developing cutting-edge technology in fields spanning from renewable energy to medicine. But our ability to ensure that our country is globally competitive relies on our ability to educate our students and equip them with the skills they need to succeed in the jobs of the future. This is especially true for minority students, who are often underrepresented in science, technology, engineering, and math fields. The bioscience research program established in this bill will support the development of standards and measurements to advance biological and medical technology. The university research centers will advance this program by conducting hands-on research and testing activities under the skills of students trained in STEM fields at educational institutions selected through a competitive application process. My amendment today adds a new section to University Research Center's program that requires the director of the program to give special consideration to applications for minority-serving institutions. We must make a commitment to restore science and innovation as the keys to a new American economy. Innovation is the future for our nation, and together we must ensure that our minority students are trained to be scientists, engineers, and prepared to become part of the workforce for the 21st century. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. Does anyone wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. I'm sorry, I misstated.
Does anyone on this side wish to make a further statement? I'd like to recognize then the gentleman from California.
A question. This issue was heavily debated in another subcommittee having to do with the hub systems and the way in which this kind of language would apply. And I think the issue needs to be brought up once again in this context. I suspect the words special consideration. What is special consideration here? And how do these bioscience research centers work in that regard? Again, it was heavily debated, a long discussion on it, and there was some language approved in another subcommittee on this issue. I'm just kind of curious if this is coordinated with that issue, or how does this work?
Was the gentleman yelling?
Yes, please.
If we could ask staff for a specific definition as well on the bioresearch program that will be established. And so then we can get into how some of the minority-serving institutions for collaborative purposes would be given special consideration to be able to provide partnerships as we're seeking to enact programs that would strengthen STEM fields specifically.
Hi. I can't speak to the definition of special consideration. I can speak to the bioscience research program. What the legislation does is establish a bioscience research program to support research and development of standard reference materials, measurements, methods, and genomic and other data to advance biomedical science.
So, Mr. Chairman, as we see institutions from around the country where there's underrepresented populations, specifically in STEM, where we continue to see areas where we're underperforming, as we strengthen NIST, as we look to other areas that we can encourage STEM growth, I think it's very important that we provide that stable footing. As with one of the other amendments that was provided today, to take into consideration how we do have underrepresented areas that require special consideration to be able to advance additional partnerships. And that's what this would be encouraging, which is consistent with the debate that we had before, which I think will be taken up with full committee markup as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The issue, if I might, the issue of special consideration, is that a direction to the director to do these programs at one or another of these universities, regardless of their current capability of doing the program?
If the gentleman would yield. Mr. Chairman, as the amendment says, if you look at page 24 after line 8, inserting the following, the director shall give special consideration to the application for an institution for higher education. That is, and they're outlined with the rest of the amendment. So it's the director of NIST to give special consideration to these institutions. Now, Mr. Chairman, I would hope that as we look to strengthen our universities and we look for partnerships, that we're able to bring in schools that have the opportunity and possibility in populations throughout the country where we can make sure that we're moving this forward.
If the gentleman from New Mexico
would yield.
yield.
I think the answer to the question is not mandatory. If that's your question, is not mandatory.
And the gentleman from New Mexico yields back. Does anyone else wish to? The gentlelady from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that this is a very important discussion as far as what the definition of special consideration, and it seems that the council does not have one. And talking about the director shall, anytime you use the word shall, that speaks of mandates and not being voluntary. I think that we really need to, someplace there has to be a definition of special consideration. It could be, we were just talking about this before with priority. Is that different than priority? Is that different than just consideration itself? If we're going to, do policy, we need to really make sure that we define those kind of terms, like reasonable doubt, whatever, all of these things that this whole amendment seems to fall on just the special consideration, and nobody can give a definition. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. My understanding is that the discussion in the other subcommittee was about an amendment which was offered and then withdrawn, and there is no further development there. The gentleman from Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate Mr. Lujan's work on this amendment. In looking at all of the language in the base bill and so forth, we just want to be consistent, and in addition to perhaps defining, so that we're all on the same page. I think that this is one of the most important topics that this Congress can bring attention to in terms of what our country needs, how we can compete in the world, and offer young people an opportunity for the future. And in not only providing them opportunity, but in resolving the challenges that we face economically and otherwise. So I would just ask that we maybe take an opportunity to iron this out before full committee markup because of the, I think, some ambiguities that do exist.
I thank the gentleman, and I think that is a positive suggestion to further elaborate on, or to at least work on at both a member and a staff level, whether further definition of this terminology is necessary. Are there any other members who wish to speak to this amendment?
Mr. Chairman, just quickly, as we talk about the question of ambiguity, I guess I would support having a discussion if additional language is needed. It doesn't appear to me that the ambiguity associated with trying to encourage treatment to encourage areas where we know that there are needs. We see science, technology, engineering, mathematics, performance, and scoring in institutions with Native Americans, populations, young and old, Native Americans that need additional assistance. Across the area, there's equal underrepresented scoring and performance with mathematics, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and lack of representation with African Americans, Hispanics, Latinos. And this is an area where I would hope that it's not a partisan issue. I hope it's something that we can definitely work on to help achieve and to make sure that we're truly helping to lift this country, move it forward, strengthen the economy, look to many of those that can provide the support that we need so that we have the capacity for engineering and mathematics in this country. It's very clear that companies are continuing to look to outsource some of these needs, and we need to look to see how we can strengthen our system domestically as well. So that way we can look to help provide the workforce that we need and the strength that we need as well.
I want to thank the gentleman for his comments, and I just want to note that the chair used his discretion to make a small bend in the procedure, and I will either yield myself such time so that I can yield to the gentleman from New Mexico for further comments, or some other member might. But right now, the gentleman from California is recognized for comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gentleman from New Mexico is quite correct in the basic argument that he's making, that we need to encourage more minorities to be involved in science, engineering, and technical matters. These universities that are specified in this particular language clearly have the population that should be interested and should have the opportunity to engage in those activities. I'm just concerned about how best to get those institutions involved in it. I know this debate was going on in another subcommittee, so this is seen in several different parts of the overarching legislation. We need to coordinate the various sections to achieve the goal. In the previous subcommittee, the discussion came down to partnerships with universities that had traditionally been receiving these kinds of research grants, that their application might score higher if it engaged these minority institutions in one way or another, or the minority institution might be partnering with. It's not clear in this language that that's achieved, and I would suggest that we really delve into this in some detail, because the thrust of this amendment is appropriate. How to achieve it in coordination with the other subcommittees is, I think, of concern here.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, and I'm quite finished and yield back and done.
All right. I appreciate the gentleman's from California remarks, and I think that we all really, this is not a partisan issue. This really is to make sure, if we're going to make this work, just to get it right. I mean, if you look at just what the Secretary looks at this and says, well, now what do I do? I think that we need to be a little bit more, have a little more either legislative intent or some changes to this, following the discussion in the other subcommittee, that I think this needs to be clarified. And I appreciate the chairman, and I would yield to the.
I guess what the gentleman yield.
I guess what California would have to.
Yeah, I yield everything. I'm finished.
Thank you. I do want to touch on the fact that there's some language in the NSF title that's inconsistent with the language of the amendment. I don't know if it's Mr. Lujan's intent to change that, if he might elaborate on what his objective is. We just want to make sure that we've got consistent language here. If you would wish to elaborate on that, or we can discuss it off the record as well.
Well, I think, if the gentleman will yield, I think the chairman has clearly said that this is something we can bring up forward. There's other legislation before us with NSF, which is not the NIST bill, and there are two different pieces of legislation that come before the committee. I appreciate the dialogue and the discussion associated with the legislative intent associated with special consideration as we move forward to the treatment of universities or those serving institutions that may be included for special consideration or other appropriate language to make sure that we're truly looking at underrepresented communities to bring them forward.
The gentleman from California's time has completely expired now, and I think that it's fair to say that given the discussion in several different subcommittees, that we will be taking a close look and working to find appropriate further elaboration of the terminology.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that I look forward to resolving this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion of this? The gentlelady from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to clarify from Mr. Lujan, and I really appreciate the amendment that he's offered today. I mean, it is just no great secret that when everything seems as though it is, fair across the board, that for whatever reasons, minority-serving institutions do not enjoy the benefits of receiving these research opportunities. And I suppose we could go into a long history about that, but the facts are true. We can see it in the numbers. We can see it in the research grants. And so there's great need to make sure that the agency is making itself known to these institutions and really considering the institutions in making grants. I would note that there's nothing in the amendment that actually, in the base bill, that would change the obligation under the university research centers for whatever institution is awarded the funding to comply with what other institutions have to do to comply to be a university-based research center. I mean, there's nothing about that. It's only saying to, I think, and perhaps Mr. Lujan could clarify, but it's only saying to the agency, it's really up to you to make sure, to make certain that you're, along with meeting these basic criteria, that you're considering all of these institutions which have, for many different reasons and for a long time, been absent from participating as research centers. And so is my understanding correct, Mr. Lujan, that there's nothing that precludes the agency or prohibits the agency from using the exact same criteria that it would use to evaluate any other research organization?
Mr. Chairman, I don't think that could have been explained any better.
Thank you, and with that I yield.
I thank the gentlelady. Is there any further discussion of this amendment? If not, the vote occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the bill? If not, the vote is on the committee print as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And I recognize myself to offer a motion. I move that the subcommittee favorably report the committee print as amended to the full committee. Furthermore, I move that the staff be instructed to prepare the subcommittee report and make necessary technical and conforming changes to the print in accordance with the recommendations of the subcommittee. The question occurs on the motion to report the print favorably. Those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it, and the print is favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Members will have 2 calendar days in which to submit supplemental, minority, or additional views on this measure. And I want to thank all the members for their attendance and participation. And this concludes our subcommittee markup. The subcommittee is adjourned.